Okay, I think we'll get started. Hello, everyone. I'm Joanne Gabriel, and on behalf of Darien Library, I want to welcome you to this evening's program, Epic Tomatoes from Your Garden with Craig LeHoullier. Have you ever eaten a freshly picked tomato off the vine in the summer? Made a summer salad with homegrown tomatoes? It's pretty darn delicious, and there is just about no supermarket tomato that compares. Tonight, we are really lucky to have with us Dr. Craig LeHoullier, who will talk about all things tomato. Before we begin, I would like to mention that programs at Darien Library are made possible by the annual Friends of the Library campaign. We thank you for your support to make programs like this possible and our collections available to the community. Our presenter this evening is the author of two best-selling books on gardening, Epic Tomatoes and Growing Vegetables in Straw Bales. His gardening obsession began in 1981 when he began tending his first garden with his wife, Susan. He soon joined Seed Savers Exchange, becoming an advisor for tomatoes, and became responsible for naming and popularizing many well-known tomato varieties. He is an amateur tomato breeder who continues to co-lead the Dwarf Tomato Project, a unique worldwide volunteer tomato breeding project that brings great tomatoes to those who choose or require container gardening. And by the way, we have some of these dwarf tomatoes project seeds in the Darien Seed Library, so come check that out. A popular lecturer across the country at major gardening events, as well as a frequent guest on podcasts and radio shows and Instagram, please welcome Craig LeHoullier.
Thank you so much, Joanne. It's such a treat to be doing this. This is the latest in my pajama series of garden talks from the comfort of my office. So how this is going to work is we're going to cover lots about tomatoes. And the first half of the talk, which will run roughly 20-25 minutes, will be helping you to navigate the incredible variety of tomatoes that we gardeners have available to grow now. And we'll take a break for just a few questions that may arise on that. And then the second half of the talk, we're going to get into really how to make this work for you, the cultural aspect, starting seeds, how to plant them, feeding, watering, diseases, because my goal is to help you succeed at this. So let's see where we're going. I always like to start out just showing a little bit about what's happening in the garden right now in Hendersonville. And anyone who has known me for some years knows that we made the big move from Raleigh, North Carolina out to Hendersonville, North Carolina, about 4 hours west in January of 2020, just before COVID hit. So the last 2.5 years has really been an exercise in adjusting to COVID in terms of me quitting the road. And in fact, the last in-person talk that I traveled for was for the Connecticut Flower Show early in 2020. And after that, everything closed down. The other thing about today is my knees hurt and I'm exhausted, but it's a happy exhausted. My wife and I headed out for one of our typical hikes looking for wildflowers. It was supposed to be 5.5 miles. The signage and the blazes weren't particularly clear in one section. So my old 66-year-old knees and my wife's knees endured 8 miles. So really sore right now, but we saw a lot of neat stuff. And if anybody has looked at my Instagram just now, they see a trillium that we took today. These, which look like a bunch of chia pets in my backyard, are the majority of my garden this year. My straw bale garden, which will consist of indeterminate tomatoes in the bales, plus dwarf tomatoes in grow bags, which you can't see yet, peppers and eggplant in straw bales, and then over on the left are bales that are already planted with green beans and summer squash and cucumbers. I just planted my indeterminate tomatoes a couple of days ago, and straw bale gardening is something we're going to touch upon in the talk. But here's 2 tomatoes sitting happily in the bales, and I went out and watered them just before this Zoom, and I think they've already grown I think they've doubled in size since this, so everything's off to a good start. And this looks very different from the way my gardens in Raleigh did because they were on my concrete driveway. We'll see a picture of that later. But this is when the garden is in full swing here in Hendersonville, when you get your grow bags and your tomatoes all growing like crazy. Last year was a really good garden, and we'll talk about that. So let's put this into context. We moved into Raleigh in 1992, and we're pretty excited about it because we figured lots of farmers markets. I'll bet you we can go to a farmer's market and find lots of diversity of colors and shapes, but no. Mostly what you would find was red. And in fact, that has been the state of tomatoes in the United States right around from when the tomato first became popular to grow in the late 1800s, all through the time when the seed savers exchange got started and heirlooms became the thing. But I'm moving ahead of myself. So let's take you back to 1840 to give you an idea on what we in the United States thought of tomatoes in 1840. Here's a page from a Breck seed catalog. And above the word tomato, there were about 20 different summer squash. You look at the listing of turnips, all types of turnips, and one singular tomato that was likely red and large and lobed and pretty ugly. The reason for this is because people in the United States really thought that tomatoes were poisonous up until about the 1850s or 1860s. So we are so lucky. There has never been more diversity for avid tomato growers to grow than we have right now. And in fact, those who are members of the Seed Savers Exchange and get the monstrous yearbook know that there is probably about 10,000 or more different varieties available for people who know about the Seed Savers Exchange. And in fact, I'm pretty sure they've opened up the catalog, so you can go on their website and do searches and find all types of things. This is that situation in reality. When we went back to that same farmer's market a few years before we moved here, the vendors now have yellows and whites and oranges and stripes, greens, pinks, chocolates, purple. So this is a great time to be a tomato lover. So I talked about all of those varieties listed in Seed Savers catalogs. In fact, if you just get the things that stimulate the love of gardening in us every winter, which is when the seed catalogs start showing up in our mailboxes, you can still pick 500, 1,000 different varieties if you get a selection of catalogs. How does a gardener even start to decide? In the first half, we'll talk about some of the ways that I can help you make that decision. So there's some terms that are important to know in terms of the type of garden that you wish to grow. So a hybrid tomato, and hybrid should not have a connotation of negativity. Sun Gold may be one of my top 3 tomatoes to eat, and it is a hybrid. It's that little super delicious orange cherry tomato. I first grew it in the late 1980s, buying it from Rob Johnson at Johnny Selected Seeds, and rare is a garden that goes by when I don't have it. A hybrid means that a greenhouse somewhere has learned that 2 varieties, when combined, create something better, more interesting than the sum of its parts. And one of the frustrating things about hybrids is often the parents are kept secret. In the greenhouse, somebody collects pollen from one parent, and they go up to flowers on the other parent and remove the anther cone and apply the pollen. A tomato will form. The seeds in that tomato are the hybrid, and that's one of the reasons that hybrid seed tends to be more expensive. It's because there is a manual labor step involved in the creation of the seed. And hybrid can never be an heirloom, because if you grow a hybrid and save seeds, or for example, if I save seeds from Sun Gold and plant them, I won't get Sun Gold again. I will get things that resemble mom, things that resemble dad, and things in between. An heirloom is a variety that is open pollinated. So we're going to skip to the right column here. Open pollinated is the opposite of hybrid. It means that if you grow it, it will come true from saved seed. So it has been grown enough so the genetics of the variety are very, very stable. An heirloom is a special type of open pollinated variety that has a story or some age associated with it. And I'm going to tell the Cherokee Purple story in a moment. So on that picture is black cherry. That was developed at Tomato Growers Supply sometime in the 1980s. So it's only about 30 or 40 years old, probably not an heirloom yet, but it's certainly open pollinated. However, an heirloom such as Cherokee Purple, and this is the letter that accompanied the seeds of this when I received it, unnamed variety. So what the letter essentially says, to paraphrase it, is it was sent to me by a fellow named J.D. Green, John Green of Sevierville, Tennessee, and he sent it to me when I was living in Pennsylvania in 1990. Mr. Green essentially said, Mr. LeHoullier, here are seeds of a tomato that originates with the Cherokee Indians over 100 years ago. It's purple. I hope you like it. So what did I do in 1990? I grew the tomato. I saw that unique color. This predates the big black tomato craze where you got the chocolates and the purples. I actually had this and black crim. I was the first person to grow black crim in the United States when I obtained it from a Swedish seed saver in 1990 in a variety called Purple Price that I got from my friend Tad Smith. And I was just amazed at the color. Now, of those three, Cherokee Purple had by far the best flavor. And I can fill in the history a little bit because I did have a chance to talk to John Green on the phone a few times. Turns out John received the seed from a woman named Deborah Greenlee, and she received it, and she lived in Rutledge, Tennessee. And her grandfather, Gene Greenlee, I'm sorry, and Gene Greenlee's grandfather received it from the Cherokee Indians in the Rutledge area, which is near Sevierville, in the late 1800s. Now, what I didn't do, and I'm kicking myself, is take a trip out there and see if I could trace it further back, see if I could find the people who gave the seed to Miss Greenlee's grandfather. But that's an heirloom. It's over 100 years old. If you grow it and save seeds, it will come true. Now, there's a set of tomatoes I tend to call tomorrow's heirlooms because they're fairly recent, and they usually arise because of a cross, and then you work it to stability or a rare mutation. So this tomato in the center is Cherokee chocolate. It arose from a plant of Cherokee Purple that I was growing in 1995 in my Raleigh garden. I had about 8 plants out there, and one of them gave this unusually colored tomato that essentially is the same size, the same flavor, the same interior color, but the skin went from clear, as in Cherokee Purple, to yellow. And that became Cherokee chocolate. I love it. I'm growing it in my garden this year. Some years later, I was growing a plant of Cherokee chocolate. I was growing quite a few, in fact, but one plant never appeared to ripen. And in fact, they started rotting and falling off the plant. So I went to the plant and grabbed one that hadn't rotted yet, cut it open. It was green on the inside. It had the yellow skin of Cherokee chocolate, but it looked as if what happened is the flesh color went to green. And I saved seed and it came true, and Cherokee Green was born. Now, maybe in 50 years or so, we'll refer to these as heirlooms, but I'd like to see how well these catch on in the meantime. So I'm just calling them open pollinated varieties that are essentially tomorrow's heirlooms. Now, one of my favorite things to talk about is something that was conceived in 2004, the Dwarf Tomato Breeding Project. For 20 years or so, we sold seedlings in Raleigh, first from the farmer's market downtown, and then from our driveway, to diversify the taste of tomato growers in the area. And one of the most frequently asked questions was, what have you got that tastes great, but it will grow in a container? I don't have to climb a ladder to pick it, because something we'll get into in the second half of the talk is the growth habit of tomatoes and how we have to choose wisely in terms of fitting them into our garden. But my answer to those customers who asked, was not a whole lot. And so I was on a website called Garden Web, and I met this woman from Australia, Patrina, who loved the challenge of doing crosses. We knew of a very few short growing varieties, a type of tomato very few people knew about called dwarf. And I'll show a picture of dwarfs in a moment. But she was taking some of our colored heirlooms that we now are able to grow, crossing them, and then I assembled a team and we worked them out to make them stable, grew them out to the 8th or 9th or 10th generation. And then we found seed companies that were interested in offering these new varieties that we felt would be very, very attractive to container gardeners. So between 2005 and 2022, we've had over 1,000 volunteers the world over, amateurs, people who just wanted to play in the garden. They weren't doing the crosses, but I was sending them seed and they were just growing them out to see what happened. All 50 states, we've had volunteers, 25 different countries. We now have 145 new varieties, stable, open pollinated varieties that are dwarf growing, but we've covered heart shapes and the typical oblate shapes and tomatoes up to 1 pound and cherries and pastes. This is what dwarf plants look like. And so the gene for dwarf growth gives a very thick central stem. It makes the foliage kind of crinkle up and turn a dark blue green. But the key thing to know about dwarfs is they behave like indeterminate tomatoes, meaning they fruit until frost, but they grow at half of the vertical rate. So dwarfs are perfect for a 5-gallon container to get a full season of tomatoes in, but you don't have to worry about 8-foot stakes and tying them and suckering them. I wanted to show you around so you could see some of our dwarfs. And the upper left is dwarf Sweet Sue, which I named after my wife, Susan, one of my favorites. And the upper right is one that's fairly new. It's called dwarf Speckled Heart. Absolutely delicious variety, very, very productive. Tomatoes are about 6 to 8 ounces. In the lower left is Fred's tie-dye. And this looks just like Cherokee Purple if you were to take a paintbrush and paint green stripes down the side. Deep crimson flesh, delicious flavor in the 6 to 8 ounce range. And we even discovered a new color in our project, the black orange. Petrina in Australia found this one. And this does have Cherokee Purple in its parentage, but we found an orange variety that has that dark coloration. This can get up to 1 pound. The flavor is just sublime. So this is one to keep an eye out for. So one of the things that is also often asked is there a correlation between tomato color and tomato flavor? So if I grow pink tomatoes, are they always going to taste like a pink tomato? And after growing and sampling over 4,000 varieties, I can honestly say there is no correlation. Tomato varieties are just like us. They've each got their own specific set of genes. Those genes code for growth habit, for color, for disease tolerance or resistance, and for flavor. So let's do a little tour. And let's say that you're the type that loves a sweet tomato. And your options would be many, many, because there's lots of sweet tomatoes. And sweet means the genetics of the tomato code for very high sugar quantities. Does not mean they have low acidity. And that's a little tidbit that I'm going to save for the end. Tomato acidity versus color and perceptions. However, Anna Russian in the upper left, White Queen, a variety from the 1920s that we found sitting in the USDA seed collection in the center upper. The gorgeous orange juice colored Kellogg's Breakfast, many people's favorite tomato in the upper right, Eva Purple Ball. And why I like Eva Purple Ball, it's not the very best tomato you'll ever eat, but it blows away the perception that all heirlooms are ugly, because these perfectly round 6 ounce orbs just are real stunners in the garden. And then we get the big yellow with red streaked types that to me taste more like a fruit than a tomato. And in fact, this particular one I'm showing, Ruby Gold, when cut, looks like a peach. And to me, it actually tastes like a peach. And then German Johnson, which is actually one of the very few authentic North Carolina heirlooms. But now we're getting into my category. I love tomatoes that are extremely intense, and the flavors attack your senses, and you think about them long after you've chewed them up and swallowed them. And these are the ones that I think about putting in my garden every year. So the pale yellow Lillian's yellow heirloom in the upper left, a tomato sent to me in 1990 by Robert Richardson, who received the seed from Lillian Bruce of Tennessee. Her sons would go to state fairs and find people exhibiting tomatoes and bring them back to her to save seeds from to grow. This is where Lillian's yellow came from. Very unique, and it's one of the very few potato-leafed, large-fruited, bright yellow tomatoes. One of our dwarf project varieties, Beryl Beauty, which stays green when it's ripe, but if you closed your eyes, you would think you were tasting one of the best tomatoes you've ever had. Nepal in the lower left is actually the tomato that converted me from being a hybrid grower between 1981 and 1985 and an heirloom grower. One of the very first heirlooms that I grew, I purchased the seed from Johnny Selected Seeds, was the best tomato in my garden that year. Rosella Purple in the lower center from our dwarf project, and Cherokee Chocolate, which I talked about a little while ago. Then there are those customers that would come up to me and say, I want a tart tomato. I want a tomato that tastes like something my grandfather grew. It tastes like something that I got at the farm stand when I took a drive with my parents when I was a child. And the person would say, because I find a lot of the heirlooms and a lot of today's tomatoes just too sweet. Well, there's an answer. You can go with Tiger Tom in the upper left, or Green Zebra, or this wonderful lemon yellow variety from Russia called Azoichka in the upper right that I've had since 1990. And it is severely overlooked. More people need to grow it, particularly in shorter season areas. This tomato would thrive in New England. In the lower left is a white dwarf, Dwarf Mr. Snow, one of the very first releases from our dwarf project. And anybody who thinks that white tomatoes are too sweet should taste Dwarf Mr. Snow, because it will be one of the most tart, acidic tasting tomatoes you'll ever eat. Same with our Dwarf Blazing Beauty in the center lower, which is orange. And then there's the old fashioned farm stand beefsteak type, Acres, West Virginia, in the lower right. So again, to set the context of this first half, these are things that when you're picking up a seed catalog early in the year will help you get some context for your decisions. Sweet, tart, well-balanced, intense. Do you want to have a garden that's a seed-saving garden? Do you want to be able to share those seeds with your friends and neighbors? Do you want it to be does it have to be a high productivity garden, or you've had so much trouble to disease that you want to stick to hybrids? Even given that hybrids will go down to disease eventually, they do give you a little more time. Then, just before we get to a break, I wanted to take you on a little tour on some highlights that I've discovered or rediscovered the last 2 years. And these are really tomato all-stars to me. So a few years ago, I love potato leaf, big pink fruited heirlooms, but they're all a little bit different. And I could never get a handle on how they were different. So I grew several of them. And here I was lucky to have them all ripe at the same time. And these are very characteristic fruits from the plants. So these are all 1 to 1 1/4 pound. The one on the lower left is called Polish. No other word. It came to me from Bill Ellis of Pennsylvania in 1990, and it's one of my very favorite tomatoes. The one in the upper center is Stump of the World, which is a variety that Ben Quisenberry, an Ohio seedsman who lived and worked until his mid-90s, popularized. And the lower right is the famous pink-fruited Brandywine. You know, when Brandywine has a good season, it will probably be the best tomato that I've ever eaten. So it really does have the capacity for excellence, but you've got to really be careful about your seed source. And this goes for all heirloom varieties. There's a lot of crossed or mixed up or mislabeled seed. Use the garden watchdog, talk to your friends, try it. And if you try a tomato that's supposed to be great and it comes out not really good at all, don't give up on the variety, but try a different source. Email me and I can help guide you through this. So the shape thing, Polish is slightly flattened and it's got some lobing around the top. Stump of the World is called boat shaped or very oblate. And that's got very deep creases. And if you know, one of the ways to know if you've got the right Brandywine is the blossom scar is smaller and it's very, very smooth shouldered. Brandywine, if you've got the right version of it, is not an ugly tomato at all. And then to show you how crazy I am about tomatoes, I have the preferred internal structure, which is this. And many heirloom beefsteak types have this. Very small seed cells, lots of flesh in between, so that when you take a slice of this tomato and put it on your sandwich, a lot of the modern hybrids, all the seeds are in the center in a ring in a hard core, and you end up with a tomato equivalent of an onion ring. You put a slice of this on your sandwich, you'll get tomato in every bite. This is another one of my favorites that the bees helped me create called Lucky Cross. And it's the only yellow red swirled bicolor I love to eat. And it's because it's got Brandywine in its heritage. And Green Giant is one of the best 5 tomatoes I've ever eaten. And this has Lillian's yellow heirloom in its heritage. And a fellow in Germany sent this to me, and I absolutely love it. And then just from last year, on the left, and the most of the tomatoes on the top, and then the end slices below it. This is a variety that somebody sent me that I just call Earl at the moment, but I'm getting with the family that sent it to me. I think Victory Seed Company will want to sell this tomato because it was one of the 3 best tomatoes of the 110 I grew last year. And on the right, just to show that you can fall back in love with the tomato that you used to love. This is Giant Syrian, which it was sent to me by a woman in West Virginia in 1990. And in Pennsylvania, it did really, really well. In Raleigh, it did quite poorly. So I figured last year I'd give it another chance in Hendersonville. And again, it was one of the best 5 tomatoes in my garden. And it also produced the biggest fruit, 2 pounds and a quarter. And the flavor was just delicious. And the last slide before we get to a break, I answered a question that I've had in my mind for a long time. Let's say I have a favorite tomato and another favorite tomato. What if I make a hybrid out of them? Will it be great? And I did that with 8 different pairs of tomatoes, but the very best one was taking Cherokee Purple on the left, one of my top 3 varieties for flavor, and Lillian's Yellow on the right, one of my top 3 varieties for flavor. And the color in the middle, it turned out to be a large pink tomato, which genetically makes sense. And I won't go into tomato genetics now, but this tomato exhibited all of the dominant traits of the 2 parents, which is what happens in the hybrid. It was the best tomato in my garden, and it was one of the best tomatoes I ever ate. Now, unfortunately, I had very few hybrid seed and they're all gone, but I've got a lot of F2 generation seeds, and I've got friends who are growing them out to see. And in the F2, the color possibilities, well, you could get potato leaf or regular leaf. You could also get red or pink, chocolate or purple, yellow or orange, and probably other colors. So hopefully that wet your whistle for the second part, which will be how do we make all this happen? I like to use this as my break slide because it's just one of the weirdest pictures I've ever taken. But there is one of our rescues, Marlin, in front, and there's one of our other rescues, Coda, in the back, and my lovely wife reading a book in a hammock, which is how we like to spend most of our afternoons. So, Joanne, a couple of questions that have come to mind for people
Yes,
before we get into?
there
Good.
are a few questions. One of them is, can you grow a big size tomato in the small containers that you showed? So, I mean, I think they're talking about big, like sort of those big fat tomatoes you get at the grocery store.
Yes. So you can, and we're going to get into that in the second half because, and this is where I blew Joe Lample's mind a little bit when he came to my house to film for our tomato course. He looked at my grow bags that were 5 gallon and they had about 2.5 gallons of soil in it. And I had a 6-foot plant in it with 1 pound tomatoes on it. So what you have to do that is think like a plant. If you've got less soil and you've got a big plant, you want to produce big fruit, you're going to use water faster and you're going to use food faster. So by really frequent watering, drip irrigation would be perfect. And I use weekly feeding. you can actually grow very large tomatoes in very small containers. Now, the thing about straw bales, I'm going to just flip this back and forth once because this is where it tends to freeze. The thing about straw bales is that I'll get into a second half is a straw bale is the equivalent of two 20-gallon containers. Last year, I was harvesting 30 to 40 pounds of fruit per plant in my bale, and I have 2 plants in a bale. That means I was getting 60 to 80 pounds of tomatoes off my straw bale plant. So yes, it is very possible to it. So let's leave it there. I'm going to come back and talk about this a bit more in the second half. And then if you have lingering questions about this, just ask them and we'll get to it at the end.
Someone's asking about the best paste tomato that you've grown.
So my favorite paste tomato is probably speckled Roman, which is a tall growing variety that has scarlet fruit with gold stripes on it. I also really love Opalka. I also love the indeterminate variety Yellow Bell. And why I like these, to me, nobody has ever run into a store, grabbed a Roma, taken a bite, and gone into ecstasy. Paste tomatoes tend to be dry and bland, and their quality comes out once they're roasted or cooked or made into sauce. Now, my view is, why use a mediocre tasting tomato for sauce? Why not use the best tasting tomatoes in your garden for sauces or paste? So I will use everything that's ripe in my tomato sauces, with the only caveat being varieties that tend to be a little more seedy and juicy, you'll just have to boil them down a little bit more. But I love to roast my sauce and not have to think about it. So I'll just put a whole bunch of tomatoes in a pan with a little garlic and olive oil, salt, pepper, and basil, throw it in a 250-degree oven, come back and stir it every hour or so. And within 3 or 4 hours, you've got the best sauce you've ever had, and you really haven't had to do anything with it. Heart-shaped tomatoes tend to be very, very low on seeds and gel. And so you get some delicious heart-shaped tomatoes that would be really great to use as paste tomatoes.
I'm just curious, do you leave the seeds in your sauce? Not everybody does that.
Yeah, I am a skin and seeds don't bother me at all. So if you were to come to my house and have a meal, you wouldn't even know they were there. So I think it's just people aren't used to finding a seed or a little rolled up piece of skin in their sauce. And we're also chunky sauce people. So I don't use a food mill. I don't turn it into liquid and separate off all. So nutritionally, I'm probably getting a little bit more fiber, you could say. But the flavor is intense and you get a lot of the nutrition in the skin anyway. But there's no right or wrong way. It's all individual taste. And when I'm getting some spaghetti on my fork, I like big chunks of tomatoes and sweet peppers and sweet onion in there, all along the same side with it.
You're making me hungry.
Well, we were so tired in our hiking, we stopped for an ice cream cone. That was our lunch. So I have not had anything since my 2 o'clock ice cream cone. So after we do this, I'm going to go find something. I'll be ravenous.
Some tomatoes.
Want to do one more question and then we'll jump into part 2?
One more question would be, do the dwarf plants you talked about, are they able to produce a lot of tomatoes? So, volumes of tomatoes.
So the only difference between a dwarf and an indeterminate is it's growing vertically much more slowly. But last year I had a dwarf glorious treat, which is a 12 to 14 ounce yellow heart-shaped delicious one in a straw bale, and I probably picked 30 pounds of tomatoes off it. So how I put it with dwarfs, and the other thing is you don't want to remove any suckers because suckers produce flowers, and you want to compensate for all that height that you're losing in it being dwarf by letting everything develop. Dwarf tomatoes are the perfect tomato for the useless tomato cage. We all know what that is, the 4-foot tall wire cone that we bring it home, and when we put a sun gold in it, sun gold's out the top in about a week. The dwarf tomatoes stay right in there, so they're perfect. You can grow it just fine in a 5-gallon container, but like all things that are growing, the more space you give the roots, if you were to just put them in a garden or a 10-gallon container or a raised bed, you get kind of a total proportionality between the amount of root space and the potential yield of it. So I would say you would be very pleased with the yields in a 5-gallon container, 10, 15, 20 pounds of plant. The other thing to say about the dwarfs is we put 145 out there, but we don't know which ones are going to thrive in Arizona and fail in Seattle and get disease in Vermont and be adored in California, because we're just an amateur group that put them out there. The next 5 or 10 years, as we start looking at where they are in seed catalogs and looking at the ratings people give them, we'll start learning more about the personalities. We bred for flavor and appearance in yield. What we did not breed for is what diseases they will or won't struggle with. So anyway, as you're
Okay.
finding, if you ask me a simple question, you get a complete answer.
I'm intrigued by those dwarfs.
Yes. Well, shall we jump in?
Yes, let's
And
go.
anything that didn't get asked, you'll have a chance to ask at the end. So here we go. I call this my Cherokee Purple Forest. And, I used to be on podcasts with Daryl Poulis. She was a wonderful garden speaker. Joe Lample, who I've done my course with, likes to call me a rule breaker. I like to think about what might be possible and just give it a go, which is how I end up refining for me, and as I talk through it, all of you, the dense planting technique for pretty much anything. So let's get into this. So again, put this hat on. What I'm trying to do with this talk is help you sort out the mystery of all of those varieties and all those seed catalogs. And so far we've talked about heirloom, hybrid, open pollinated, colors, types of flavors. Now we're going to get into making them grow. So this is when you think about what your timing's like, what your season's like, what your weather, what your garden constraints are in terms of hours of sun, et cetera. So size does matter with tomatoes. And what I mean by that is, if you want to grow that huge mortgage lifter on the left, that's 2.5 pounds, you're going to need a good 6 to 8 hours of direct sun a day. And you also have to realize that if you have a stretch of 90 degrees and above for 3 or 4 days and warm, humid nights, the flowers are probably not going to set fruit very well. So the huge varieties, although they're impressive and wonderful, tend to be the fussiest types to grow, and you need truly ideal conditions, but there are things you can do as well. So if it's 90 for a week and your mortgage lifter is in bloom, just go up and gently flick the flowers once or twice a day. That will help the pollen move a little bit more easily. The pollen will move from the anthers to the pistil and you'll get pollination. Let's say you get 4 to 6 hours a day. You could probably have pretty good luck with tomatoes at around 6 to 8 ounces, maybe up to 12 ounces. They tend to be less fussy about fruit set when it gets really hot and humid, and about hours of sun. But even if you've only got a couple of hours of sun that hits a spot in your yard, you can grow a cherry tomato, grow a sun gold, get a nice container, put a sun gold plant in it. It will stretch, it'll be really tall, but you will get fresh homegrown tomatoes. The other important thing to note about plant habit and your garden is that indeterminate varieties, of which 95% of tomatoes are, that's the gene that's been around the longest. That's me in a garden in Raleigh with a Cherokee Purple, probably in mid-July. I'm 6 feet tall. That Cherokee Purple is 8 feet tall. What is it going to do in August and September? So you need a strategy for indeterminate tomatoes, a Florida weave, tall stakes, big wide tomato cages, topping them when they get to the top of the stake, etc. The two that are the solutions for people who don't want to grow the real tall varieties are determinate varieties. That's shown at the top. They have typical foliage. In fact, they look just like typical tomatoes until they get about 3 feet tall. Then they stop growing upward. They flower everywhere, and you end up with this huge crop of tomatoes over about a 2-week period, and then they're done. So Roma and the different types of Romas are determinate tomatoes. Taxi is another very well-known determinate. There's so much fruit produced on this type of a plant. I call them a ball of tomatoes, and there's just not enough photosynthesis going on in the leaves to compensate for all of those tomatoes. So you'll never get the absolute best flavored tomatoes in a determinate, whereas the dwarf down at the bottom right, incorporates the best features of indeterminates, meaning they fruit gradually until killed by frost, and the amount of foliage to fruit never goes out of whack ratio-wise. So you'll have plenty of photosynthesis to develop flavors. But they top out at about 3 to 4 feet. And a lot of people ask me on different dwarfs, how tall is this one or how tall is that one? And what I tell them is, think about how tall your tomatoes typically get and divide by 2. So I used to, for a couple of years, I measured growth rate of tomatoes. And I found that when they're really cranking along in the middle of the summer, an indeterminate tomato grows 2 to 3 inches each day. So that explains the problem. 7 times 3 is 21. That's almost 2 feet of growth just in a week. That's why they go out of control. Dwarf varieties grow an inch a day or less. So think about that as you're picking your seeds out. Calendars or mental calendars or understanding dates are really important for your garden. Tomatoes are, they're not hardy to frost. So what you want to do if you're a seed starter is think about when your last frost date is going to be. And I like to count back 2 months. Now you can, if you've got things in earlier and you've got a frost coming, there are things you can do. You can put a black pot over it, make sure the hole is covered. If it's only a few degrees of frost, you could use frost cloth or agribon or remay, or you could use the wall of water devices, which absorb water you set them up around the plant. They absorb water heat during the day, and then at night they push that heat back to the plant. But it's not much fun if you've got all your tomatoes in and a frost is coming. So let's get a little bit more into this. I've found this to be very, very useful no matter where I've gardened. And it takes about a month to get from a planted seed to get to where you want to repot it, plant it more deeply. If you plant like me, you've got a cluster of 50 seedlings that want to be separated. And then once you do that separation, it takes about 1 month to get that into a plant that you could sell, donate, or put in your garden. Let's focus just a little bit about seed starting, because this is pretty mystifying to some people. And one of the biggest things that can go wrong with starting your own seed is damping off disease, which is when things pop up and then all of a sudden the plants start falling over because a fungus has eaten away at the stem right at the soil level. Most important thing is to get a sterile, fluffy, soilless seed starter. ProMix, go to a catalog like Johnny's, or go to a nursery and ask for a seed starter. I used to love to use Sungrow's Metromix 360. I used it for decades. It turns out that when COVID hit, there became a vermiculite shortage, and then Metromix couldn't make the 360 blend anymore, but they make the 830, and they've replaced the vermiculite with perlite, and I used that this year, and it worked out great. I fill my container, and then I water it, and it's okay to bottom water. I top water. And then what I do is sprinkle seeds on, and then I sprinkle dry planting mix just until I can't see the seeds anymore. So another thing that people do that slows things down is they plant their seeds too deeply. I'm planting mine less than 1/16 of an inch deep. And then I mist with a little bit of water and put a sheet of saran wrap on top. Now you could put one of those plastic domes on, but the seed is so shallow that you don't want to lose moisture around the seed. And then I have it on a constant temperature heat mat that runs at about 80 degrees. It doesn't warm the soil up all that much, but it works great. And I will put up to 50 seeds a cell. And I've done this for tomatoes and peppers and eggplant and lettuce and greens and flowers, basil, herbs, beets, anything that's small seeded, if you don't mind doing the transplanting step. So this is what things will typically look like about a week after I've started. Well, this looks like about the 2-week mark, but typically I'll get 90 to 95% germination in seed that's 10 years old or less in about 3 to 5 days. And this is a joyous sight when you see something like this. So once you're here, the next thing to do, and definitely The saran wrap keeps the moisture in, and I actually flip it every day because with the heat mat, you get condensation, and I don't want those beads of water against the newly germinating plant. So each day I just flip it over. That puts the wet side up and the dry side on the seed. Once the plants are germinating, the majority of them, I remove that, and then I will also unplug the heat mat. And because what I don't want to do is heat that up with nothing to keep in the moisture, because those, if you're not around, I'm a retired dude, so I can kind of keep an eye on mine all the time. But if you're at work, you don't want all of your seedlings to dry out. Now, once they get to a couple of inches tall, you've got a couple of decisions to make. Well, the main thing is you need to start hardening them off. And there's a couple of ways you can do this. And I'm not even going to go into all the types of grow lights because I keep things simple and inexpensive. I just use plain old shop lights, but they run cool, and you can actually lower them to where the tubes are about an inch from your seedlings. What I've started doing much more frequently the last 3 or 4 years is almost completely eliminating the light stage. And that's easier for me in North Carolina here, where we have lots of mild days in the spring, and I'll start easing them out. And so it will be a day where it's partly cloudy, or I've got filtered sun coming through the pine trees, and I'll give them an hour or two outside when it's in the somewhere from 48 to 52 degrees. And I repeat this daily and increase the time outside, and I start making that time outside more intense in terms of sun, until within a week, week and a half, they're living outside, and the only times they come in is when we have threat of a frost. So let's say your seedlings are now clustered in, and they don't have to be clustered. Let's say they're growing 2 to 3 to a pot, or even they could be single, but they're growing too fast for you and you want to cover up some of that stem. This is the step I use to transplant, and this is when I'm separating a cluster of maybe 30 or 40 Cherokee purple seedlings. So I'll take that same mix and I'll fill pots with it. I like to use strips of light plastic that are all together, but they're perforated, so they're easy to separate. I transplant into dry planting medium because once you water it, the surface tension gets greater, and as you're pushing the seedlings in, you could snap a stem. So this is dry mix. I ease them in with my finger. I can actually do about 250 per hour now. Pulling those plants apart, it doesn't matter if tomatoes lose some roots, because any part of that stem that's underground will quickly root. And that's it. And then I water them very well, and they go on to the floor of my garage for maybe 2 or 3 days. Because if you were to put these out into direct sun, you'd fry them. The roots haven't had a chance to learn how to take up water again in their new home. And, as you're hardening plants off, we've had in Raleigh a case where we're going on vacation and there's a frost forecast. So my plants are maybe 2 or 3 inches tall, pull them all into the garage. We go away for a week, make sure they're well watered, and then the clock does not go back to zero. When you come home, you can just get them out and everything continues. So that's starting from seed. If you go and buy, there's nothing wrong with buying plants wherever, nurseries or big box stores. If you grow your own seedling from a seed, you know how you've treated it. And that means if you fed it, if you've not fed it, et cetera, et cetera. When you buy a plant from somebody else, you don't know how they've treated it, but you also don't know how well they've cared for it. And all of us have been to stores where the plants need watering and they look half dead. But the other thing about buying plants elsewhere is having faith that they're going to be what you think they are, but that's a whole other topic. I like to start my own seeds, and I know not everyone can, but I'm willing to help people through. I've got videos on my website. So now these are some general principles about growing tomatoes. And this is our side yard when we lived in Raleigh. I hand dug that garden. And the reason I went to container gardening and driveway gardening is because trees grow. And we were down to only getting a few hours of sunlight here, so we had to move everything. But tomatoes hate wet feet. If you dig a hole and the water doesn't drain for days and you plant a tomato into that, it's going to look like it's thirsty, but it's actually suffocating. So tomatoes love well-drained soil. People will ask about earth boxes, and they're different because they have their water reservoir underneath and a wick that pulls water into the tomato plant as it's needed. But if you put a tomato plant in a container in a pot and then have it in a big bowl of water that never dries out, you will drown your tomato. Mulching is maybe one of the most important things a tomato grower can do, because a lot of the problems with tomatoes splash up from the soil onto the lower foliage, and they're typically common fungal diseases like early blight or septoria. I use untreated grass clippings, and if you can create a breathable barrier that breaks down and feeds the soil, and make sure you use untreated grass clippings, because if you have herbicides, and these are all that they will, if not kill your plant, they will severely stunt it. But you could use shredded newspaper, you could use shredded bark, you could use plastic with slits cut into it. You got to make sure the tomato can breathe, the soil can breathe, and water can get through. In terms of watering and feeding, there's some websites that talk about dry farming tomatoes to intensify flavor. What happens if you don't give your tomato plant enough water and it gets stressed is you'll invite blossom end rot, and we'll talk about that later. So tomatoes are happiest when they're stress-free, so adequate watering and adequate feeding. And if you're in a garden, you water and feed less because there's a table of water under the garden the roots can reach. If you're in containers or straw bales, you're watering and feeding more because the water goes out the bottom, the roots can't get them anymore. The roots take up whatever food is in there, you water it away, you need more food. I actually water my straw bales and containers pretty much daily once the plants get established. We'll have weather here 82 to 88 degrees most days, and those big plants drink a lot. And I feed each of my straw bale or container plants about a cup or a cup and a half of just an all-purpose plant food, stirred up into a solution, 1 tablespoon per gallon. And each plant gets 1 cup a week, and everything seems really happy. So for container gardening, anything goes for containers. It may be at the aesthetics, what you choose. I love those black plastic grow bags that I show on the left because they're less than $1 each, and I keep them for 15 or 20 years. They last a long time. They're pre-punched with holes. Things like eggplant and peppers whose roots love heat. If you've had a disappointing time with yields for eggplant and peppers in your garden, grow them in a black plastic grow bag, your yields will go up tenfold. It's just remarkable. This looks a lot different than my garden in Hendersonville. This was my Raleigh driveway garden. I hand watered. I didn't set up a drip system. The reason I like to hand water is because I get to see what was going on with each plant every day. So I could see where the disease is coming in. I could see where the bug was starting to chomp. The most important thing about container gardening, well, you have to have a hole in the bottom, but it's kind of garbage in, garbage out. If you just go to a big box store and buy bags of stuff called garden soil or topsoil, you'll get clay and sand and possible diseases and stuff that doesn't drain well. So same principle as seed starting, use a good quality soilless mix. If you've got a super sod near you, they sell the big yellow cube, soil cubed, which is like their compost, which works really great. I use just a bagged soilless mix, such as Stay Green potting mix that they have at Lowe's, and I'll cut that in a 3-to-1 ratio with black cow compost manure, and my containers are really, really happy. Yes, you can use your planting mix as long as your plants get nothing worse than just typical foliar diseases. If they get something that has a root vector like fusarium or verticillium wilt or nematodes that act on the roots, you don't want to use that for the tomatoes the next year. I love straw bale gardening. When I look at this, I see 2 20 gallons of perfect growing medium for the plant. And all it takes is putting it through a 2-week process where you're hitting it with high levels of nitrogen on alternating days. You're watering it every day. And then after about a week, you're hitting it with a 10-10-10. Water it every day. At the end of those 2 weeks, your bales are ready to go. and you're not really adding any planting mix except what you're using to fill in the crevice. So the bales get nice and soft. You can just punch your fist in and create a crevice, seat your plant in nice and deep, use some of your potting mixture to just fill in the hole, and then you just start watering. I don't even feed my plants for about 2 or 3 weeks after they've been in the bales. And this is my setup last year where I've got each of my plants with a tall stake. And that's what happens. Now so these are all indeterminate varieties, which means we need to talk about suckers and pruning. That green growth on the left edge of each picture is the main stem that goes upward. Coming outward at almost 90 degrees is the leaf. At a 45-degree angle at every junction is the sucker. Suckers are neither good nor bad. In fact, what they are is additional main stems that will flower and give you tomatoes. If you let them all grow, you better have a nice big concrete reinforcing wire cage around them and be on very rich ground, because you'll have tomato machines. Removing suckers, leaving suckers does not make tomatoes smaller or larger or make them taste different. It's just all about the plant. It's all about controlling what the plant really wants to do. If you let suckers grow to 6 to 8 inches tall, stick them in a glass of water, they root in about a week, and you can give people an exact clone of that plant. I do that a lot to sun golds and another variety I grow, Mexico midget, because once people eat it, they want it. So I just always clone them and give them the rooted suckers. If you remove no suckers at all, this is what you end up with. This is my garden from 2 years ago, where I was using ladders, tables, chairs, everything I could find in my garage because my plants got too heavy. They all fell over. It was pickup sticks. And a garden like this will be productive, but it's very hard to tend and water, and it's very hard to find the tomatoes that are ripening. And it is a highway for diseases to spread plant to plant and for pests to get in there and start chomping on the fruit that are near the ground. And what I do now is I will let 2 or 3 suckers grow per indeterminate plant and tie them to a stake. And when they get to the top of that stake, I just top the growing tips, and that's it. So if you sucker a plant completely and just have one growing stem, you will get whatever the flowers that form every 10 inches produce in tomatoes. If you let a second sucker go, you double the potential yield. If you let the first sucker, if you let the second sucker grow, you'll have 3 stems, you'll triple your potential yield. So try different methods and see what works best for you. This is what scared us last year. We were picking 50 pounds of tomatoes a day for a month and a half. We were doing canning, we were giving them away, we were seed saving, we were eating. So if all works well, you'll have lots of tomatoes. But I had 109 plants last year. I'm going to have about 50 this year. What can go wrong with tomatoes? Almost everyone who's grown a tomato anywhere will see something like this on leaves, and it does spread. It's called early blight, and it is a fungus that will blow around or splash up, and it adheres to wet foliage. Then it starts doing its thing. The other is septorial leaf spot, which is another fungus that operates very, very similar to early blight. I don't spray. What I like to do is separate your plant so that you can get as much light as possible all around the plant, get wind breezes going through, and then as soon as you see things like that on the leaves, get them off the plant. The plant will continue to grow at the top, but if you leave these, the spores are at the underside of the leaves, and they will just blow around and infect the rest of the plant. Some of the worst things that can happen in tomatoes are things that come up through the roots. So let's say you go out someday and everything looks good, and then the next day you go out and you've watered your plants and the plant looks like on the left. All of a sudden it just starts wilting, but it's still green. You water it, of course, it will come back a little, but in a few days you look on the right and it starts going bright yellow. That is the sign of fusarium wilt. And fusarium is a fungus that's in the soil, and it shuts off the water transport in the plant, and essentially the plant can't drink, so it dies. get rid of that plant. But the most important thing now is you have fusarium in that soil where that plant was. So you can't put another plant there. You could cover it with something and put a container on if that's a really good spot, or you could rotate away from it for three years or so until it works itself out. The only pest I want to show is this little guy, the tomato hornworm. They eat fast and they eat a lot. They're hard to find. If they're just green, like that one with none of those white ricey things on their back, just get it, destroy it, put it in your bird feeder, get it out of there. If they've got the white material on them, like in the upper right, those are the pupa of a parasitic wasp. And once those hatch, they will eat the worm from the inside out and create more wasps that will go and parasitize more hornworms. They camouflage. And let's say one of them is destroying your plant and you can't find it. You buy an inexpensive battery UV light on Amazon and go out at night. And my neighbors think I'm pretty crazy. So to see this eerie purple light in the garden at night, once you see a bright green fellow light up, you've got your tomato hornworm. So they do fluoresce. Tomato foliage goes purple under UV light and the hornworms are bright green. Just a few other problems. We're going to wrap this up soon and get to questions. You remember I talked before about withholding watering on plant. If your plants show visible wilt on the hottest part of the day and you're underwatering them, you are inviting the interruption to the normal process of calcium uptake in the plant. And it doesn't matter how much calcium you add to your soil or whatever, you'll get blossom end rot because that's what happens when a plant is stressed. It can't use the calcium that's there. So keep your plant stress-free and you'll almost eliminate. Tomato plants do a lot. You'll probably always find 1 or 2 tomatoes on each plant that have a little bit of it, but it won't be on every fruit. Now, the right-hand thing is what happens if you want your tomatoes to hang on the vine until they're vine ripe, and then you get a thunderstorm, or you water them, and the tomato absorbs water and swells and pops the skin. So the way to minimize that is to pick your tomatoes half ripe. And this is called picking at the breaker stage because tomatoes ripen from the inside out. And as soon as the bottom half of the tomato is colored up, you can then pick it and leave it on your counter. And in 2 or 3 days, it will color up fully and it will taste indistinguishable from the tomato that you left vine ripe. And the other advantage is this tomato on the ripe is a critter magnet. Squirrels, birds, they can smell it a mile away. And so you'll have less damage if you pick your tomatoes half ripe. This shows what tomatoes end up like. If you pick them half ripe and ripen them indoors, you'll see very few to no cracks on them. And this is an example if you miss that and you want to aim for that vine ripeness and you start seeing those radial cracks. 2 seconds about seed saving because some of you may want to do this. Make sure it's not a hybrid unless you want to do genetics experiments and go fishing for something great. But you can take any type of tomato, cut it, just ripe condition, squeeze all of the contents, the seeds, the gel, the liquid into a cup. I put it outside on a warm day. I drape paper toweling over it, then put another tray on top because this is going to smell really bad and the flies will be drawn to it. But in about 2 or 3 days, a fermentation process happens that dissolves the gel that's on the seed that allows the tomato to be 92% water, but not full of tomato plants when you cut it open. Once that fermentation starts, the clock starts and the gel is removed and the germination inhibitor goes away. So if you leave that for a week or more, you'll have a little cup of tomato seedlings. Bring it in the house after 2 or 3 days, fill it with water and stir. The nice thing about this is the good seeds all sink to the bottom. You just pour off the goop, repeat that a few times, and then just sieve the seeds. And I like to just press them onto an unglazed paper plate and they dry in about a week. And you have yourself seeds that can be stored in a multitude of different ways. I don't freeze my seeds or refrigerate because I don't have the room. So I get about 10 or 12 years of germination out of them. But if you were to refrigerate them, making sure they're dried down to an adequate point, you can get 20 years or more. And if you do the same thing, dry them down really well, maybe with silica gel, put them in an airtight container, you'll have tomato seeds for 50 years or more. So let's end on a luscious and attractive note. We can grow so many different types of tomatoes. And if for chefs, for people who like to cook, for people who like differentials of flavors, this is the joy of summer for us in our house. So one of the favorite things we do is we'll just do a daily tasting. I'll just see what's ripe, cut them up, and leave both plates in the same order because Sue and I eat them kind of clockwise and then comment on them, which helps us to kind of calibrate our palates to each other. Do one of us taste things a little bit sweeter than the other or a little bit tartar than the other? But doing this, you can get a pretty good idea of what you love. This is kind of a funny picture. So when Joe Lample and I were taping one of the segments of our course, we did our very first ever blind tasting. And everybody on the street that day decided to use chipper shredders and string trimmers in their lawnmowers. So to do a simple blind tasting took us all afternoon. Joe and I were not amused at this point, but the blind tasting was incredible. Because what happens is some tomatoes that you think you love, if you taste them blind, you realize you don't love them as much as you think, and vice versa. One of my favorite things to do with tomatoes is, and I combine this with seed saving because you'll see a lot of those pieces on the left have no seeds. I just squeeze the goop into my compost bin or whatever. Slowly, I put olive oil, little drizzle, salt, pepper, and put them in a low oven for about 3 hours. And then you can make this super delicious roast tomato tart that has other ingredients like goat cheese and lemon juice and roasted almonds and basil and garlic and Parmesan cheese. Anybody interested in the recipe, I can supply. And we'll end on this busting the myth. People used to think pink tomatoes, white tomatoes, all of these different colored tomatoes had less acid. But the USDA did this great study in the 1970s where they tested hundreds of varieties of tomatoes, and they found that the pH is in a range about that big. All tomatoes really can be considered equally acidic. The reason that low acid tomatoes taste that way is the genetics code for more sugar. And the reason that acidy tomatoes taste acid is because they're low sugar. And the great news about this is so I grew 109 types of tomatoes last year. The 63 quarts that we can could have any of those 109 varieties. Here's my books. Anybody who's interested in getting signed copies can just contact me through email. Writing them was a real treat. It's something I never expected to do. So I'm just really gratified to those who show an interest in this. I garden because my grandfather there on the left, Walter, the guy with the carnation, he and my grandmother's 50-year anniversary, used to take me into his garden when I was 2 or 3 years old and taught me the joy of gardening. And my father, Wilford, on the right, used to do the same. They planted a seed that stuck with me forever. So your job for the night, I hoped I shared some things to help you grow a better garden. I want you to all go out and grow a gardener. Get some of those seeds from the seed library, plant them with them. People in the neighborhood, kids, the elderly, people who are lonely, share something about gardening, and us gardeners actually have to save the world. I'm convinced that it will be gardeners who save the world. CraigLeHoullier.com for my blog, frequently asked questions, videos, etc. nctomatoman@gmail.com for email. nctomatoman for Instagram, and I now am live every Thursday at 3 o'clock for 45 minutes, taking questions and doing demos. And the course I'm doing with Joe will reopen for new students next spring. Feel free to take a picture of this. Of the 4,000 tomatoes I've grown, these are my favorite tall growing tomatoes. And after I take some questions, I will show my next slide, which will be my favorite tasting dwarf tomatoes out of the 145. I so appreciate Joanne for asking me to do this. For those of you who attended, for anyone who watches this in the aftermath, building a network of gardeners is just a wonderful thing. And gardening becomes a friend that you will always have. And I don't know what I would do without it. So thank you. Thank you, Joanne, and thanks everyone. I'm ready to take questions.
That was terrific. Thank you so much. Wow. We do definitely have some questions. One question is, so you have your plants growing, your tomato plants growing out there. What do you do about little critters? Like we have a lot of groundhogs, deer,
Yeah.
bunny
Oh
rabbits, that
gosh.
kind of thing. Is
Ah,
there any tips?
So when we were in Raleigh, we had squirrel issues, and they were in my driveway, and they were everywhere out there. So we found, interestingly enough, that we started feeding the birds in our backyard, and there was a suet feeder and seed, but it was squirrel proof. And we also had a bird bath back there. And the squirrels actually would go into the backyard and drink water from the bird bath, and they would sit under the feeder and wait until the woodpeckers and bluebirds would peck the suet onto the ground and they would eat it. So critters typically will go after tomatoes because they're thirsty. Now there are exceptions to that rule, but if you provide another food source or another water source nearby, other than that, you're getting into, the typical have a heart trap, relocate, which not everybody likes or not everybody can do, and it's not that successful anyway. But people with severe pest problems end up having to erect some sort of a physical barrier, whether it be, fences around the plants, or as the fruit are forming, putting a nylon stocking around it or some other type of a barrier. I'm pretty lucky. For deer, the only thing I found that worked in Raleigh, and we had a big deer population because our neighborhood built its house in the deer's house. So we had a lake in that area. The deer just said, "Oh, good, they're feeding us now." Um, a motion detector sprinkler, and there used to be two brands, Contec and Orbit. Um, they're kind of ridiculous in that the Contec one particular, the price would be X, and then 2 weeks later it would be X times two, and then they'd change manufacturers and it would be made really cheaply. So avoid that one. And it's the Orbit. I think it's the 6100, and maybe they're $60, but they're 9-volt battery operated. And as long as you remember to change the battery regularly and turn it on, it really works quite well. It's also really good for spraying unwanted door-to-door solicitors, as we found out once in Raleigh, where somebody rang our doorbell at 8 o'clock dripping wet, and 8 o'clock's too early to turn off the deer sprinkler, so it just thought he was a deer. So I told him, I said, "Well, thought you were a deer," but that's kind of what works. Great, tall electric fencing, well installed, of course, but anything else, coyote urine, mothballs, Milorganite, dried blood, transistor radios, sprays, garlic spray, anything will work for about a week. And a hungry deer will say, they don't want me to eat that. And they'll say, "I'm just going in." And so, yeah, you can go through many, many attempts. Groundhogs, ugh, that's really have a heart territory. Get somebody professional working with pests in the area to get their advice on it. Really tough stuff with some of these.
I've had success with the apparatus you were just talking about, the motion sensor with
Yeah.
groundhogs.
Yes.
Um,
Really
and
great.
Another patron is asking, they never know if they've watered enough, as
Hmm.
they have a small kitchen garden with 10 to 12 tomato plants.
Hmm.
How do they judge without waiting until they wilt? Is there a way to do that?
Um, you can do the finger test in the soil. So if you stick your finger in and it feels pretty damp around 1 or 2 inches because the roots are going down, depending on if you're in a garden or a raised bed. Now you could very well be in a container, but the same would apply. Go on the assumption that if you're in a container or a straw bale, it's better to overwater than underwater, because you can't overwater. Anything the plant needs will just come out the bottom. I mean, it may be a little bit wasteful, but really the thing to do is to go out at maybe around 11 o'clock when the sun is just starting to get high, and just look at how the foliage is looking. And when I lived in Raleigh and had containers everywhere and it got really hot, I would often water at 9 in the morning. Then I'd come home from work and water again at 5 in the evening, just enough because the plants looked like they had had a tough day, and I wanted to give them a breather to go through the overnight with. So yeah, I would learn to read the plant. And if the plant looks happy, you can be happy. But if the plant looks a little bit wilty, then it would be happier if you watered it.
And on your straw bales, how many
Mhm.
plants are on typically? Is it 2 plants typically?
Yeah, so a straw bale is good for 2 eggplant, 2 peppers, if they're bell peppers or the big like jalapeno type. But if you're using the little ornamental hots, you can just put as many as you want. They're not fussy. 2 tomato plants, that includes dwarf determinate or indeterminate. But for things like, and I would say a hill of no more than 1 or 2 squash plants. But everything else, just seed it like you would if it were in the garden. So green beans, beets, anything like that, just use your normal spacing. But yeah, if you do more than 2 plants, the nutrition would be there for the roots. However, the spacing would be thus that you'd just be inviting disease because the plants would be just way too close to each other.
And where can you get these straw bales normally? Is it like a Home Depot kind of
Home,
situation?
yeah. So Home Depot, these are great questions, by the way. So Home Depot and Lowe's will typically stock them. And let's say I've been straw bale gardening for about 6 years and I've used a couple of hundred bales. Twice I've had straw bales that clearly had been, the fields had been sprayed with an herbicide that persisted in the bales and they killed my plants. And those 2 bales came from a big box store like a Lowe's or a Home Depot.
Huh.
However, the good news is you're less likely to get residual herbicides in straw than you are in hay. And so if a lot of times grasses, an herbicide will be used on those, and then you'll want to buy hay to use as a mulch. Many a garden has been ruined by working in infected hay. So you have much less of a chance of that happening. A better bet is to find a smaller garden center. In Raleigh, I had 100% good luck with just smaller garden centers. And the same with here, where they'll often stock things like pine bales and straw bales and stuff. Just don't go for the pine because it repels water and wouldn't break down and be very successful.
Someone's asking if they've heard that they are composters and they shouldn't put tomato pulp waste in there because it might cause disease. Do you agree with that? Or
No, tomato pulp waste is absolutely fine. What you don't want to put in would be clippings from tomato plants. And I know that there are some people that say, if the plant looks pretty healthy, put them in there. I just don't want to take a chance because some of the disease could have gotten into the vascular system. But the problem with putting pulp and peels and stuff in the compost is that wherever you put the compost, you're going to get volunteer tomato plants. So if I look in the back of my compost bin, there's like 500 little babies coming up around it. Now I don't grow any of them to maturity because I don't know what they're going to be and I don't need them. But a lot of people have kind of just grown on volunteers and things out of the compost. And if you may get some really interesting results if you're short of a tomato plant or two.
so we at Darien Library in the seed library, we have some seeds that you recommended from Victory Seed Company. And one of my questions is it too late to start seeds right now, or do people ever direct sow tomato seeds?
You can direct sow for sure. In fact, some tomatoes, they germinate okay, but they grow poorly in artificial light and in cooler conditions. And mortgage lifter, yellow oxheart, it's just Dr. Witch's yellow. Some varieties just have a genetic trait. So what I do with those is I just take a little pot and put the seeds outside in the sun, make sure I water it every day with a watering can, but the tomatoes will do great. What you want to do is the math. So let's see, where it's first week of May. So May, June, let's say you get those plants out that you plant now, June 20th or so. Do you have 90 to 110 days before your first frost is likely to come in? I think it would be fine to try it for some of the earlier ones, certainly the cherry fruited ones. And, but you get 25 seeds in a pack and they're good for 10 years. What's to lose? I am of the give, if it sounds good, give it a try, because there's always next year camp rather than, yeah. And the other thing about gardening that I like to tell people is don't get so hung up on the destination, the 20 pounds of plants per day, because the joy of gardening is everything you do every day to get there. The things you learn, the birds you hear, the people you talk to, the things you uncover and discover. So I love gardening. It's like ingrained into my life. And so try things, put your science cap on and just give some crazy things a try. I found out you can actually start carrot seeds in a small container, transplant the little seedlings into plug flats, pop them into the garden, and you have nice, long, straight carrots. So many garden myths are there to be busted. Bust a few, have some fun.
That is so true. Because I think everyone says that carrots really should not be sowed
Yep.
indoors or anything
Right.
like that. So it's one big experiment, and
Yes. Yes.
it's fun, and there are no heartbeats, as I always like to say. So you're not really, you're dealing with little seedlings, and
Mm,
which goes to another question I had was all
mm,
those seedlings that you grow together,
mm.
do you separate each one
Yeah.
individually? Oh
Yes.
my golly.
So this is how, so why do I do this dense planting technique? And it was because in Raleigh, I wanted to sell seedlings, and that meant getting about 5,000 seedlings in my driveway in an office in front of a window. And by using that technique, I could get 2,000 seedlings going in a footprint of 1 by 2. If I were to individually sow those cell by cell, every surface of my 2,200 square foot house would have been covered with plants. So it's the efficiency of scale and space drove me to trying that. And I spent many a pleasant evening with listen to the fluorescent lights buzz with those big damselflies buzzing around, having a beer and transplanting for 2 or 3 hours, smelling the smell of that planting medium on your fingers, and it gets totally ground in for about a month. You'll never get that off. So only when you go to the beach can you get your feet cleaner if you're a gardener. So these are things you need to know.
I love it. So one patron is saying that they had a volunteer plants that overwintered. Are those okay to just leave in your garden to grow?
If it's a tomato, sure. It must have been in a particularly favorable spot, but yeah, let it grow and see what you get. It'll be fun. And any of you who try these things, you're contributing to the knowledge base of all of gardening. So share your results, and then everybody kind of learns something
That sounds
from everybody else.
Um, and I think the last question I'm going to ask you tonight is, this is going to be hard. Is there an all-time favorite tomato plant that you've grown? I mean, is it the Cherokee purple? Is there one that really stands
Yep.
out in your head?
So this is funny because when the book first came out, Lynn Rosetto Casper wanted me to be on the Splendid Table. And the last question she asked me is, you're stranded on a desert island. You can take 3 varieties with you. What would they be? They were Sun Gold and Cherokee Purple and Lillian's Yellow Heirloom. It's kind of like, so gardening is like a lot of things, books or music, where I like Mahler. I've listened to a lot of Mahler symphonies, but sometimes the first time I've heard a symphony is my favorite one, even if I've listened to 20 other versions. Gardening is filled with nostalgia, and when you try a tomato for the first time, what you're doing in your life. So I may love these 3 just because of the people who sent them to me so long ago, and the fact that they thought enough of me to send me their family treasures. And so the flavor may be an A, and the extra context drive it up to be an A plus. But any of you listening, try a blind tomato tasting this coming year, and I'm going to do more of them because the results are absolutely shocking. We eat with our eyes and with our memory and our expectations. And if you take that away, you just get some really crazy stuff coming out. So, you know, gardening should be a lot of fun. I'm always out there laughing at something. Usually all those straw bales are an obstacle course for our 3 dogs, and they never bump into a single bale or a single plant. I don't think it's because they love me. I think it's because they're like, oh, cool. We get to run around and see how dexterous we are. So it's so much fun. Anyway, I hope that helped everybody to grow some great tomatoes.
So FYI, someone's asking about the Lillian's yellow, which
Yep.
I do have a few of these seeds here actually
Yeah.
at Darien Library. And I also have the Cherokee. I can't remember what you said about the third one. So
Sun Gold, the hybrid. Yeah, that's
oh
harder to
yes,
come by. Yeah.
So anyway, stop by the Darien Seed Library and pick up some seeds. And thank you.
Well, thank you for having a seed library, because they become controversial in some areas. I think they're great. And so bravo.
Thank you. It's been a lot of fun meeting people. Just like you said, gardening is a wonderful, wonderful social activity. So anyway, thank you everyone for attending tonight. And thank you, Craig, for this wonderful talk on tomatoes. And I hope that everyone has gained some insight into that famous member of the solanaceous family, the tomato. Thank you again, and good night.